Good evening. I hope you are well. So we're going to cover some ground tonight, so I'm going to jump right into it. But the title of the sermon is God is patient and slow to anger, but he will act. And as we're motoring through, we're going to cover I think three different nations that are being judged. We have Assyria, Philistia, and Moab. And so 3 points tonight. Point one is when God is determined to act, no one can frustrate his work. And many times when we're looking at the will of a father, and I've said this before, especially if we haven't had a good example in our lives, we don't understand the warnings and the messages. We just, it's kind of always out of reach. And Hebrews talks about this, that if a son has, or a father has a son, that if he loves him, he will discipline him. And the one thing that we keep gathering out of Isaiah is the reality that God is the God of all nations, and that Israel had been set before them to be a beacon, to draw them. And so as the Lord is correcting Israel, even with the use of the Assyrians at points, you have Philistia or the Philistines raiding. You have Moab, who, if you remember early on, they would not allow the children of Israel during the Exodus to pass through their land. But Moses was told not to attack them. And why is that? Well, it's because oddly, in a very weird way, and we'll talk about that if you have kids tonight, I don't want to say things that lead you to a conversation you don't want to have, okay? So if they're watching, if you look at how Moab came to be, it was because of a relationship that shouldn't have existed, and a father who was intentionally drugged by his daughter. Does that make sense? Okay. Excellent. So a little bit of an adult discussion there, but I want to give you a heads up that is in the mix tonight. All right. So when God is determined to act, no one can frustrate his work. And it's just the same with not the same, but it's like an earthly father who sees trouble on the way and warns. I have stories from my children's upbringing. Some of them I shared, but there are times in dealing with my oldest sons, and I was a pretty young dad, but I had made mistakes and I had been overly confident, and I still kind of was, and that ultimately led to me, with the knee injury and nearly losing everything, because, man, being overly confident will bite you. And we'll find Sennacherib, who is the king of Assyria at this point, ending up in the same situation. The Lord had allowed them to ascend to power, and he was using them, but they went too far. If you remember Sunday morning, they went too far. And no matter where you are at in your life, that is a possibility. Okay? As we read through the Word, there are entire books dedicated to the idea of us getting ourselves humbly before the Lord and realizing that we are not all that and a bag of chips. And it's a hard thing to face when our perspective of self is challenged with reality. And so the Lord had determined that he was going to punish Israel, but in the process, Assyria, came into the crosshairs because of their behavior. And so we always need checks and balances. At times it's the word alone. But if you find good accountability and people that truly love you, they're going to say things to you that are uncomfortable. They're going to point you in the right way. And there's times that those messages are harsh. I pray they don't have to be. And it's interesting that when we're immature, we will consider a harsh message offensive because of the tone as opposed to the message. You feel me on that? And so in this, Israel was afflicted because of their disobedience, and Assyria is destroyed because of theirs. Point 2, God does not forget the troubles caused by those who do evil. As he deals with Philistia, which if you want to get an idea where they were at the southwest corner of Palestine. Okay? So, Palestine. I mean, people to say it doesn't exist, but the whole place was called Palestine for a while. And they were prone to invade. They raided Israel. They did any number of things until they were ultimately subjugated to Assyria by Sargon II, and that was roughly a 711 BC. So as we go through this, not every date is firm, but they're pretty darn close within a few years, all right? And these timelines are laid out, and you'll even see the fact that Jeremiah prophesies against Philistia in 609 BC, and we'll go through that. That's in Jeremiah 47. And lastly, God deals harshly with the hardened heart. And the hardened heart, that'll be for chapters 15 and 16. Everything else is in 14. But Moab knew the people of Israel. All right? They were related to Abraham. It was the product of Lot, right? And if you remember the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, that's Lot being rescued. His wife turns to a pillar of salt or something thereof, and Lot, is left in the wilderness with his 2 daughters. And some things unfold that are not good. They're not good. And you could look at Lot, and Scripture talks about how his soul was troubled because of the place that he was in, but his daughters were affected by it. Man, be careful who you have around your children and who gets to speak into their lives. They will repeat patterns that look foreign to us because we haven't seen them in ourselves. And they will also learn from those who speak into them a value system that will lead to their ultimate destruction. And this can be friends, this can be family, but it's up to us to be the gatekeepers, which means we have to mature. And for the sake of our children, we can't remain in the old ways. And it's not to say that we haven't faced traumas, trials, tribulations. That's not what I'm saying. But there are very many times that we have issues in common with people, but we're not able to move them anywhere, because it's one thing to suffer the same thing. It's another to overcome it. And and the Scripture talks about this, until you've overcome it, a situation, it doesn't promise you any type of liberty just because you have traumas in common. That's not going to lead to victory. And so as we watch and learn tonight how God is going to deal with these nations, and we're going to cruise through this, all right? I say that now. I do have Altoids. Hold on. These are my time clock, in case you're wondering. If you're tuning in for the first time, I try to remain disciplined time-wise, and God provided Altoids as a measure. So let's jump in tonight. We're going to read the first chapter because it's short. So we'll read the declaration against Assyria and the judgment against Philistia as well. Verse 24 of chapter 14 in Isaiah. So the judgment on Assyria. The Lord of armies has sworn, saying, certainly, just as I have intended, so it has happened. And just as I have planned, so it will stand, to break Assyria in my land, and I will trample him on my mountains. Then his yoke will be removed from them, and his burden removed from their shoulders. This is the plan devised against the entire earth. And this is the hand that is stretched out against all nations. The Lord of armies has planned, and who can frustrate it? The answer is no one. And as far for his stretched out hand, who can turn it back? I want to say it right off the bat that we will read through the Old Testament. There's times the Lord has put things, if you read the story involving Moses, puts things before Moses, and he does test him. He does try him. And there's times that Moses is fed up and he's like, kill all of them. And other times he's like, Lord, don't kill them. Don't kill them. So when God is determined to act, no one can frustrate his work. God's work is above all the ways and all the minds of men. It is very difficult to understand him when the only perspective we have is ourselves. This is why I like Proverbs so much. I read Proverbs as if I am, and I listen to Proverbs as if I am the enemy of every bit of counsel that is given. All right? That means not in the sense that I'm going to resist it, but I more so mean I'm going to be on the wrong side, which means it's constantly applicable. If you're reading scripture and it's not constantly applicable to you, then you're reading it from the wrong standpoint. Okay? If the message is coming by the voice of the Spirit through the prophet, and the writer puts it to paper, then it is written to resist those parts of me that would destroy me. And whether I like the fact that they're present or not has nothing to do with it. If you are honest with yourself, you know very well that Jesus gave us warnings about things that go on in our hearts, things that go on in our minds. And he says, listen, if you hate your brother, you've committed murder. If you look at a woman and you lust after her, you've committed adultery. Well, obviously that hasn't played out in the physical aspect, but it demands a level of conscientiousness with regard to what is playing out within us, because the more those things take place, the more likely they are to be a reality, not just in the consciousness, but become a physical action. This is why self-control is important. You can write it down now. We're headed towards Proverbs 16:22. Okay? So listen how this plays out. The danger in elevation is that we lose track of who and what we are in the process or in the grand scheme of things. In our lives, we are warned against pride lest we also fall. And Paul puts this out there plainly. And there's times you're going to be judged by people, and it's a false judgment. And then there's other times where you're going to run into people who read your mail. And man, it's a hard thing to be known. I've talked about this. I've done investigations where people are the centerpiece, if you will, of all my concentration. And whenever I did those, I always kept in mind what it would feel like. And I've been through backgrounds myself, more than one. So I always kept it in mind what it would feel like to have someone's entire concentration focused on you. And it was a good reminder that in spite of all the people that are in this world right now, God can still think about me. And God knows the number of hairs on my head. You know what I'm saying? So we get worried about one person or persons, if you will, that are not omnipresent. They're not everywhere at one time, and yet God is. God is. And Sennacherib loses track of this reality. You know, his God and his mind was allowing him to overcome even the God of Israel, not understanding that the Lord was using him as a tool to discipline them. And history records how it is that God overcame the armies of Egypt and crushed them and did all of this stuff. These things were not lost. And so as we're warned by pride, or warned about pride, we have to take into account the fact that we are also vulnerable to falling, just as others have in our past or may in our future. But looking at the king of Assyria, King Sennacherib, yes, sorry, the Altoids are not always a favorable item for pronouncing Old Testament names. Sennacherib, he was neither humble, nor was he really smart. He was able. I mean, some of these people were masters. I think the word talks about Nebuchadnezzar for Babylon just being a tactical genius. But because Sennacherib's heart was dark and he had chosen to blaspheme God, it wasn't enough to be winning. And there's stories about this in 2 Kings chapter 19, verses 20 through 37. We'll get there in a second. But God shows him roughly in about 701 BC. And Assyria is going to be broken. And 701 BC is the first real hit. They're not totally free of them, I think, until around 600. I have it in here. 605 BC, when Assyria is defeated by Babylon. So again, some 90 some or 80 some years later, 90 some years later, this comes to fruition. And the timetable of God looks so different because of our mortality. And so there's times we're going to play a role, and it may be an uncomfortable role. We may be in a season of recovery. We may be in a season of revolution or revelation. There's times we're affected by the people around us. And the servants of God remain loyal to him in spite of what everybody else did. But in this, you'll see in 2 Kings chapter 19, 20 through 27, Hezekiah has prayed a prayer concerning the army of Sennacherib and the fact that to a degree they are encompassed and the onslaught was going to be devastating. And so he prays a prayer, and Isaiah, after this prayer, the Lord moves upon Isaiah, and Isaiah sends a message to Hezekiah concerning the Assyrian onslaught. And in that message, he foretells how God is going to intervene and rescue them from this. You ask, what kind of intervention is it? Well, in verses 35 and 36 of chapter 19 of 2 Kings, God sends one angel at night, and in the process, he kills 185,000 Assyrian soldiers. Well, Sennacherib breaks camp and returns to Nineveh. How does it go for somebody that has no humility? And not only that, returns to a God who failed them. Well, we find out in verse 37 of 2 Kings 19, which is he goes to worship his false god, and two of his own sons murder him. They run him through with a sword. They strike him down, basically. So they assassinate him, and they leave the country and flee to a foreign land, and he is succeeded by his son. The word tells us that a man that cannot control his own heart is destined to be destroyed by his own creations. Not only did the words of his mouth lead to the death of his own soldiers, but his conduct led two of his sons to slay him. This doesn't seem like he's ending his life in honor or victory. In fact, I think it's pretty safe to say that it's evidence of delusional thinking. And I think it would also be safe to say that even when we believe we are on top of the world, if we're an abusive individual, we don't really take stock in mowing over the weak and the weary and the wounded. We don't put that in the proper frame of mind. And so we don't slow down long enough to consider the results of our own behavior. And it's important that we do this as men and women, but as men as well, as what kind of man are you going to be, and what legacy are you going to leave? I certainly don't believe that Sennacherib, in his wildest imagination, I mean, we don't have a ton of history on this, believed that his own two sons, or two of his sons, would strike him down. But it happened. So here's a man with all of these great conquests, everything before him you could possibly think of. And God shows up, puts him in his place, strikes down 185,000 soldiers. But this defeat did not move him. He was still committed to himself, which is why you find him worshiping a failed God. And this addiction to self is ultimately what leads to his fall. Again, Israel was not truly free of Assyria until 605 BC, when they ultimately were defeated by Babylon. In Proverbs 6:22, it tells us this: better a patient person than a warrior, one with self-control than one who takes a city. Point 2 tonight: God does not forget the troubles caused by those who do evil. In chapter 14 of, I have to speed up even more because I did not realize my phone was going to go dead on us. Let's see here. Where were we? Chapter 14, verses 28 through 32. Judgment against Philistia. In the year King Ahaz died, this pronouncement came. Now there is, and I will say this, a little disagreement about where that verse belongs. If it belongs to the aforementioned section about Assyria or Philistia, but it still reads well. So we will keep it where it's at. It says, "Do not rejoice, Philistia, all of you, because the rod that struck you is broken." Now this is a reference to the death of Ahaz. Now Ahaz at some point had asked for help from Assyria in dealing with certain regions that they were having difficulty dealing with. So Ahaz had defeated them at points, things were happening. But here's what happens. Here's what unfolds, all right? For from the serpent's root, you get it? So from Ahaz, the serpent's root, a viper will come out. I'll explain a little bit more. And its fruit will be a winged serpent. Those who are most helpless will eat, and the poor will lie down in security. That is a reference to Israel. All right? That's a reference to Israel. Now we're back to Philistia. "I will kill your root with famine, and it will kill your survivors. Wail, you gates, cry, you city. Melt away, Philistia, all of you, for smoke comes from the north, and there is no straggler in his ranks." This is the army of Assyria. All right? So they are coming from the north, and there is no straggler, which means they are organized, they are put together, they are ready. Philistia was not ruled in the way that most of us think, and they were not ready for such an onslaught. Even if they were ready, they were not capable of dealing with what was coming. Verse 32, "What answer will one give the messengers of the nation? The Lord has founded Zion, and the poor of his people will take refuge in it." In essence, you may be celebrating right now, I'm going to encourage you to stop, because what's coming after this will be your end, but Israel will survive. All right? Does that seem to kind of sum it up? So in this, again, oops. I don't know why this thing keeps moving. Philistia was located at the southwest corner of Palestine. It was a troublesome nation, had taken root in the land that God had promised to his people. The Philistines were prone to raid Israel for a period of time until ultimately they become a vassal state of Assyria under the rule of Sargon II, somewhere around 711 BC. The Philistines ruled as a group, and they were told that even though Ahaz had died, the rod that had struck you, they should not rejoice. Ahaz had asked Tiglath-Pileser, Assyria, for help in dealing with certain regions, including Philistia. But from Ahaz, a serpent, would come another viper, right? And in this, you find Hezekiah's rebellion, right? And in Hezekiah's rebellion, the Assyrians would come to the region to wage war. In verse 30, we see that Israel is given hope, as they would survive the onslaught, but the Philistines would not. A rebellion in 711 BC involving Gath, Ashdod, and Azdudamu, would be crushed, and the people would lament and wail because of the outcome. God was going to allow Israel to survive because he had deemed it so. He had established Zion, and that was going to remain no matter what occurred. because the Lord had declared it so. But all of these reprobate nations would be destroyed. Assyria is shown to be effective. They've been shown, and they are shown to be disciplined, something Philistia was not. They were not ready or capable to deal with such an overwhelming force. This is declared by Jeremiah in chapter 47, verses 1 through 5. All right, it's roughly around 609 BC that this is done. And it says this is the word of the Lord that came to Jeremiah the prophet concerning the Philistines before Pharaoh attacked Gaza. This is what the Lord says. See how the waters are rising in the north. They will become an overflowing torrent. They will overflow the land and everything in it, the towns and those who live in them. The people will cry out. All who dwell in the land will wail at the sound of the hooves of galloping steeds, at the noise of the enemy chariots and the rumble of their wheels. Parents will not turn to help their children. Their hands will hang limp, for the day has come to destroy all the Philistines and to remove all survivors who could help Tyre and Sidon. The Lord is about to destroy the Philistines, the remnant from the coasts of Caphtor. Gaza will shave her head in mourning. Ashkelon will be silenced. You remnant on the plain, how long will you cut yourselves? You see, if we are on the wrong side of a situation, if our hearts are hard and God has spoken, we will ultimately wage a war that is unwinnable. For you and I as well, Jesus warns us that don't fear man that can take your life. The reality is to deal with a God who can do the same, and after such throw you into hell. Now, we may not like that message. It's not preached very often within the church because we want kind of a very comfortable Jesus, a very predictable reality, and it's fantasy. Jesus came as a suffering servant who would be afflicted. But the reality of what Isaiah foretells is that upon his shoulder would rest the scepter of power, that all power and authority were in him. And you say, well, some would argue, well, then why was Jesus crucified and why did this unfold? Well, because his plan was far greater than we could ever imagine. I know we study it, but it's still unbelievable that it was accomplished for us in such a manner. That the God of heaven, who was perfect in each and every way, came to live among us. And when he was here, we just didn't see it. And I count that for myself. Some people say, well, you weren't there at that time. I'm pretty sure at points about my own heart and about who I would have been and what I would have thought. I pray that I wouldn't have been too smart. I pray that I wouldn't have been too confident. But there's points in my life that I look back that even with a warning that is so beyond clear, I ignored it because I was attached to my delusional state or my hopes and dreams. And I want to tell you, the thing that can pollute you the fastest is buying into hopes and dreams that are contrived. They're contrived by us because of injury. They're contrived by us because of anger. And we will give anything away at points for them to be true. And in doing so, we harm our relationship with God, and we create a threat for ourselves in that. And there is in this, as I was studying, a mention of Zion theology, which maybe this sounds familiar. But the people of Israel believed so firmly and were encouraged at points with regard to Zion and how God would be their defender and God would be their protector. But because they had become so self-consumed, they twisted and morphed this into a belief that God would protect them in spite of their behavior. in spite of the fruit of their lives, in spite of who they were at that moment, no matter what they were doing. And so they lost humility. They lost the willingness to be introspective. They lost the willingness to learn. And they became slaves to their own appetite. And in doing so, they destroyed everything. And the story of the garden is important for us to remember. Very, very often, everything can be going our way, provided in every way fashion, every fashion imaginable, and we can still find reasons to be discontent and angry. And I think it's a treacherous thing when we do that, to then believe that no matter how we're conducting ourselves, and the word talks about the fruit of our lives being judged, that somehow, some way, that God's not going to be true to his word when it comes to us. I don't want to live like that. I feel like that is incredibly dangerous. As I read the word, it is clear that this is not a pattern that we want to repeat. So lastly, God deals harshly with the hardened heart. Moab was initially a people treated with favor because of their relationship to Israel, because Lot was Abraham's nephew. And I had mentioned before how this son came to be in a manner that is disgusting. And you can find that story. I don't have the reference here, but you can go back to reading about Sodom, Gomorrah, and Lot and his family escaping, and it's shortly thereafter. But if you look back to Deuteronomy 29, Moses is warned not to attack them because God had given them the land. However, because the Moabites would not grant the Israelites passage in their exodus from Egypt, they wouldn't allow them to go through the land. They were never brought into the assembly of God. And I want to make it clear, it's not that assemblies of God, all right? Moab was under the control of several kings of Israel, David and Omri, for example. And after the death of Ahab, they broke free, only to later be subdued by Joram with the help of Jehoshaphat and a few others. Moab was later overthrown by Assyria and forced to pay tribute under 4 different kings. It lasted quite a while. Here's the kicker, though. They later allied with Nebuchadnezzar. Is anybody getting a plethora of spam calls? Because it's just, I'm up to 8 today. But anyhow, but they later allied with Nebuchadnezzar and ended up working as mercenaries against Israel. They worked for him as mercenaries against Israel. They too, just as Sennacherib, also engaged in blaspheming God, mocking him, and they claimed Israel was in every way just like everyone else. There was clear animosity from the Moabites towards the Israelites. And the chapters, as we read it, it starts with a foretelling of a quick conquest of their major cities. An overwhelming force moving through their land, taking them one by one. Ultimately, Moab would look to Israel to a degree for safety, but the chapter records that Israel will ultimately protest because of the Moabite pride and arrogance. Moabite considered their tactical position to be their safety. They lived in cliffs. Their cities were a little different, but this was no match for the Assyrians. God tells them that even if they were to attempt peace or try to make a peace with Israel, it was too late for their land, and they had harmed their relationship with both God and Israel. They were known for their vast vineyards. In fact, what I was studying, it went into discussing how large some of these vineyards were. But those were all to be destroyed. In fact, they were known for the delicacy of raisin cakes, which sounds moving. But they would offer these cakes. Don't laugh when I make those jokes. They would often take these cakes and offer them to their god Chemosh, who would ultimately prove to be a false god. In Isaiah 16:11 through 12, it spells out how Moab's incessant idol worship hurt the heart of God, and he was going to bring it to an end. But their unwillingness to yield their hearts to a God they knew was true was going to cost them absolutely everything. We look to the New Testament as we close in this, in Hebrews chapter 12, verses 25 through 29. Spells it out plainly. See to it that you do not refuse him who speaks. If they did not escape, Israel, if they did not escape when they refused him who warned them on the earth, how much less will we, if we turn away from him who warns us from heaven? At that time his voice shook the earth, but now he has promised, once more I will shake not only the earth, but also the heavens. The words once more indicate the removing of what can be shaken, that is, created things, so that what cannot be shaken may remain. Therefore, since we are receiving a kingdom that cannot be shaken, let us be thankful, and so worship God acceptably with reverence and awe, for our God is a consuming fire. I would challenge you tonight in this, and I know that we kind of cruise through that, to take stock of the things that are going on in your head and your heart. Sometimes we read these and we're like, yeah, God, get them. Get these enemies of your people. Get these enemies of this. Get my enemies too. But I think it's important that we slow down and consider what makes us an enemy of God. And I don't do it to intentionally cause fear. In fact, I try not to ever really preach in an overly emotional way. And I hope I've been somewhat successful in that. I want to reason with you, which is how the book of Isaiah begins, is that let's sit down and reason through this, and let's consider the pros and cons of our current season. How are we contributing to those things that are positive and negative? And if we refuse to do the hard work of heart and mind, I think that we will continually misunderstand the work of God and the warnings of Scripture. Again and again, God pointed to these nations and he said, hey, you better knock it off. You better knock it off. And they wouldn't. In fact, just as Sennacherib, who gets his behind handed to him by Yahweh, he returns to his own temple and he doubles down on his own conduct. And in the process, we get a glimpse of how it was that his kingdom actually operated. Because when your own sons conspire in such a fashion as to put you to death in your own, in your own temple, if you will, I don't think there's a lot that is good that can be said. I think if we will consider the lives of these men and the lives of these nations and be prayerful and honest, are we suffering as Moab because of excessive pride? Is arrogance, pride, and fury something that is involved in our lives? The word tells us clearly that the anger of man will not bring about the righteous life that God desires. And if we're called to seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and anger, arrogance, pride, fury, those things are inhibiting us, then we're choosing false gods. We're choosing a relationship with our own emotion that's just going to lead to destruction. And we remain in fantasy until all the walls are down, until everything's burned up. And I just frankly think it would be a poor decision to take things that far. Have I seen that in my own life? Yeah, I have. I'll be honest with you. I believed for a long time that I was different than everybody else, that my life would be different just because I willed it to be different. And it was easier to judge people's conduct than to look into my own heart and my own mind and begin to consider the value of my concentrations. And when it all came crashing down, it was just God and I. And I remember that season, people were telling me, oh, the Lord's going to heal you. You're going to be back on your feet in no time. And I remember praying over that. And the Lord said, absolutely not. That'd be the worst thing I ever did for you, John. And some would say that was kind of harsh. Why didn't God do more? God had done everything he needed to do. I was the problem. And maybe you're sitting there tonight going, man, if I open this door and start thinking in that fashion, how long will it be? The rest of your life being much better than it is right now. That's how long it'll be. That transitions everything. And I'm not saying I have it. Paul says the same thing. I'm not saying I have it all dialed in. My goodness, please don't say such things. Really, I beg of you, please don't say such things. I am prayerful in my considerations. I take time. But when I see a pattern, I know a pattern. When I hear something coming, because the word has made it clear in Proverbs and the teachings of Christ, that the next step is A, B, and C, I don't think it's going to be anything but A, B, and C. Yep, I agree, brother. Oftentimes we are our own issue. Absolutely. I believe the word, and I believe in the consequences of disobeying it. I've seen them firsthand. I've watched them in my own life. I've watched them in others' lives. I have given people warnings, and I have received warnings. Okay? I have learned to pay attention because not paying attention really hurts. Okay? And I want to tell you this. I went out after the injury on my own. And one of my biggest fears, and maybe fears running you right now, was that if I had answered the will of God, I couldn't have made it financially. And so I started a business that required me to walk every day, miles and miles sometimes. One day it was 18 miles that I walked. I was on a Monday, and I had a bad leg. I could have done exactly what God asked me to do. And it wasn't fantasy to get it done. It wasn't. It wouldn't have been. But I had to limp through that season, not because it was the will of God. It's because I picked that season. I said, God, I'm not willing to hear unless it's painful. Maybe you're afraid of that. Maybe you are. I will tell you that what I learned is that I went through far more pain trying to avoid it than if I had just obeyed. I allowed myself to become proud. I allowed myself to be elevated by the words of man and the appreciation of accomplishments and things I was just doing, which seemed good, but they weren't the will of God. I pray what it is that the Lord is saying, and you'll know that he doesn't fail the humble. He doesn't fail the righteous. His promises are for you, and you can do this through the Spirit. You can. God can walk you through this. Maybe you're in a season just like where I was, that you are suffering at your own hands. He will still walk through you. He will still walk it with you. Will it require a repentant lifestyle? Yes. Is it worth it? Absolutely. Listen to me. It's worth it. Please listen. It's worth it. It's worth it. I love you guys. I'm praying for you. Be encouraged. Know that your hope being set on Christ will never prove fruitless. Ever. Ever. It's everything. Sunday morning, hope to see you guys, 11:15, the Eagles. Take care, all right? See you soon.